Well, I think we're ready to get going. So welcome to all of you who have joined us. Welcome to the Green Ribbon Commission Climate Action Exchange. My name is John Cleveland, along with my colleague Amy Longsworth. We staff the Green Ribbon Commission. This is our interactive virtual program series designed to support our mission of accelerating the implementation of the city's climate action plan. Our program today focuses on the opportunities for reforming wholesale electricity markets in New England to support aggressive decarbonization strategies of the Commonwealth and cities like Boston, and in particularly how sub-state actors, cities, and large energy users can get engaged in this reform process. As we all know, the decarbonization strategies of cities like Boston are highly dependent on successful decarbonization of the electricity grid. Over 35% of Boston's emissions comes from electricity consumption. And to achieve the city's goal of carbon neutrality, all of our lighting, plug loads, cooling, thermal electrification, and vehicle electrification will need to be powered by carbon-free electricity. The market mechanisms, governance, and planning functions for the ISO New England were all developed in a time when grid decarbonization was not yet a state and city priority. And as a result, the mission of the ISO was focused on the twin goals of reliability and affordability. But in light of the global imperative to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050 or early, it's clear that the ISO mission must encompass decarbonization. And I'll just provide a little quote here from the Commonwealth's draft Clean Energy and Climate Plan, which states, quote, "To achieve the energy system transition described in the 2050 roadmap, least cost facilitation of the state's decarbonization efforts must become the primary focus of regional system planning and markets in the next decade." So that's what we're here today to talk about. And as many of you are aware, the Biden's administration's really aggressive goal of decarbonizing the grid by 2035 has created a commitment to position the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission as an enabler in this transition, and that's a big part of this shift, and we'll talk about that a bit on the program today. We have a great panel to guide us through this really complex and sometimes kind of geeky territory, and they'll explore how this market is evolving, including those aspects of policy which really need to change, and also examples of large energy users and cities creatively organizing to get engaged in this. Our first panelist is known to many of you, Judy Chang, Undersecretary for Energy, Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And she leads Massachusetts' effort in setting policy across the energy sector in the state, working across all state agencies and aligning the strategies and plans for decarbonization. She's an energy economist and policy expert with a background in electrical engineering. And prior to joining the commission, she co-led the energy practice at the Brattle Group, which many of you are familiar with. She's going to start by just providing us with an overview on the market policy and governance reforms needed in our wholesale electricity markets for Massachusetts, and which now, as we all know, now includes a 50% target for reduction in overall emissions by 2030. Our second panelist is Greg Geller. He's Senior Director of Regulatory Affairs for NLX. He leads Enel North America's regulatory affairs team for the eastern half of the United States, with management responsibilities covering all the states and ISOs in this region. And I'd like to note that the CEO of NLX, Syria Panditi, serves on the Green Ribbon Commission and has been a very active member. Enel's presence in North America includes, but it's not limited to, Enel Green Power, which has over 6 gigawatts of renewable generation, and NLX with over 4.7 gigawatts of demand response capacity, 70 energy storage projects, and an e-mobility offering that's developed over 700,000 smart charging stations across its footprint. During his 11 years at what was Enernoc and now Enel, Greg has successfully championed policies and regulatory constructs that are enabling a transition to a cleaner, more efficient, and more resilient grid. He's going to provide us a deep dive into some alternative market mechanisms that have the potential to increase the capacity of wholesale markets to attract and expand renewable energy generation and enable large users to directly participate in these markets. So for those of you who are wholesale market geeks. This is a geek alert because Greg's going to get into all of the kind of nitty-gritty details you're really interested in. And last but not least, we have Madeline Schuh with the City of Philadelphia Energy Office and a member of the PJM Cities and Communities Coalition. Maddie is the Senior Energy Management Analyst at the City of Philadelphia. She manages the Municipal Energy Management Database, evaluates and tracks city government energy use, and assists the strategic procurement of city government energy supply. In her role as the Philadelphia representative on the PJM Cities and Communities Coalition, she coordinates PJM regional cities in their efforts towards decarbonization of wholesale electricity markets. These efforts are aligned with the City of Philadelphia's commitment to generate or purchase 100% of all electricity for the city's built environment for renewable sources by 2030. And I should note that Enel played a critical staff support and consulting role in the launch of the coalition that Maddie is part of. So she's going to provide us with an overview of the coalition, how it has helped cities influence wholesale markets, and also lessons for other regions like ours that might want to launch something similar to that. So each of the panelists is going to do a presentation, and then following the presentation, we'll have time for 25 to 30 minutes of Q&A. So just a couple of logistical notes. A, we are recording this session, and B, shortly after the session, you'll get an email with a link to the recording and the presentation slides, and also include a link to a short feedback survey. In terms of the Q&A session, if you have questions for the panelists, we ask that you put them in the chat box, and I will be drawing from the chat box for the Q&A session. I'll remind you before each of the presentations to do this so that we get a nice, robust set of questions on that. And last but not least, of course, please mute yourself if you're not speaking. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Judy, who's going to lead our session off. Judy?
Good afternoon, and thank you so much, John, for the kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this really interesting panel and discussion around how wholesale market needs to reform and what the role of the state and cities and all voices should be chiming in on this important topic. Next slide, please. I would just like to I prepared a few slides to just talk about the linkages between the state policies that we're driving and the efforts that we're working with other New England states and the ISO New England to reform the wholesale electricity market and all the planning processes. So I start by just making a note, and John, you mentioned this. We currently have conducted already a roadmap study, which lays out different alternatives and different scenarios for reaching net zero economy-wide by 2050 for the state. Subsequent to that study, we also now have a law that Governor Baker had signed that tells us we have to reach 50% economy-wide greenhouse gas reduction relative to 1990 level by 2030. My team at the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs is working on updating our Clean Energy Climate Plan for 2025 and 2030 to align with the legislation to reach 50% reduction economy-wide by 2030. The reason I emphasize economy-wide and grid, because I want to just make sure that when we talk about net zero and emissions reduction, we're clear about some of the targets that are set out there so that there'll be less confusion. So we're currently developing a plan and the timeline for all the updates that's necessary. We will also be setting the 2025 economy-wide emissions reduction goals and how to achieve those. And these are a substantial amount of work that we're taking on now to make sure that we incorporate and engage with stakeholders and members of the public in developing plans and policies to reach the 50% reduction by 2030, but also planning for a longer term or 2050 net zero. Next slide, please. So the roadmap study, which focused on 2050 and articulated the different pathways to get to a net zero, there are multiple pathways, but something that were consistent across various different scenarios and pathways are the following: a balanced clean energy portfolio anchored by significant amount of offshore wind resources, and I will add also solar resources. Second, more interstate transmission that will allow us to access renewable and clean energy resources in our neighboring states as well as from Canada. Widespread electrification of transportation and building heat. And this is significant because what we're trying to do is clean up our electricity grid while moving most rest of the economy onto a clean electricity grid. And this is a huge change, I'll just say, to the traditions that we've always had. And then the last one is making sure that we reduce everybody's costs while doing these transitions by replacing energy infrastructure, including our own home infrastructure in our homes and in our communities at the end of their service lives. So the cheapest time to change over is when you already have an equipment at the end of their lives. So all of the transitions that we're trying to deploy are capturing those opportunities as people are changing their equipment. Next slide, please. Now, what does that mean for the wholesale market, and why did I bring that up before we even talk about the wholesale electricity market? Because I wanted to couch on why we're heading into a major transition. And this transition is significant for our own buildings and our own transportation, but it's also significant when we think about our electricity grid and the future of our electricity grid. And this chart on the right-hand side here shows you the increase of the installed capability of the various different resources that we have to support the electricity grid. So you can see that, we are essentially doubling or more the installed capability of our resources across the New England grid. This means that we will have significant amount of offshore wind, significant amount of solar, but as well with storage and demand response. So we need the collaboration of not only large-scale solar and wind resources, but also individuals and customers to respond to the need of the system as we move forward. And then I just added this sort of like a long list, but only a brief version of the long list of the reforms that we need across our electricity system. So this is before we even get to the ISO and the market that it operates, right? So we need to reform advanced distribution and transmission planning, deploy distribution and transmission upgrades. That itself is a huge amount of work. Deploy advanced meter infrastructure so that we can access and understand how consumers are consuming their electricity. Deploy electric vehicle charging infrastructure to support electrification of transportation. Deploy and develop new clean energy financing mechanisms. The current one works, but what does that mean when we start going into 80% clean energy? Wholesale electricity market reform, ensure competitive electricity rates for customers, and then address energy and environmental justice issues while advancing all of our systems. Next slide, please. Back in October of last year, the governors of the New England states sent a letter to ISO New England to explain the necessary changes in our wholesale electricity market. So the rest of the slides here are touching on the reforms that we are asking for on behalf of the states in hopes that working with market participants, the wholesale market participants, and the ISO, we can accomplish these reforms so that the market, the wholesale electricity system and market can accommodate all the clean energy resources we need at the least cost for consumers. So on the slide here, I'm not going to read all of it, but are the goals that we want the wholesale electricity market design reform to accomplish. First and foremost, it should meet the state's decarbonization mandates. And as John mentioned before, our electricity grid and the market design was never designed to make sure that we meet decarbonization goals. But we're at a juncture where those things are changing. We are moving toward, and I would say fast forward, in decarbonizing our electricity grid. We can't do that without the partnership of our ISOs and all the market participants in our wholesale electricity system. Okay, next slide, please. I'm going to just very quickly touch upon wholesale electricity market design for those that are not eating and breathing this every day. We currently have, broadly speaking, energy market, capacity market, ancillary services market. These are sort of broad stroke types of market in our New England system. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission regulates these markets. So we have to work with our sister states in any reforms and changes that we want, and with ISO New England, which is also regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. We have seen significant issues and problems with the part of the market, capacity market, and with this new administration and the new Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, there's actually going to be a relatively fast and changing reforms to the capacity market. Because of some of the issues that you see here on the slide, customers are essentially paying twice for clean energy, and states are now looking at alternatives to the traditional capacity market we have today. Next slide, please. One of the proposals on the table is this thing called Forward Clean Energy Market, and those have been involved with the stakeholdering process know that this has been in discussion actually for over 5 years. But now it's really come to a point where all of the New England states are gaining understanding of what this means, what this proposed approach means, and why it's one of the ways, and probably the best way or the preferred way, to advance our clean energy market and have a centralized New England clean energy market, as opposed to sort of just currently each state has its own renewable energy RECs market, renewable energy credits market, that's associated with the RPS, as well as contracting for resources that each state wants or needs. We are proposing, as part of the states jointly through NESCO, proposing that the ISO study the forward clean energy market and understand what advantages it could provide to the states and all of its stakeholders. The diagram on the right is borrowed from presentations done by the broader group on what our current system looks like from a developer perspective, from a generator perspective, what revenues it would get, and what the future would look like if we did nothing. Our wholesale electricity market will need to go through a transition because the market revenues are changing as we speak. So the proposed forward clean energy market is essentially that yellowish, greenish slice on the right-hand side of that graph, showing you that the clean energy attributes market will bring additional revenues to clean energy resources in the wholesale electricity market. Next slide, please. The next section of the reform that we need is in transmission planning. This is also just by itself a huge deal. I mean, it's a huge deal. We traditionally have planned transmission when generators want to interconnect and when load increases, such that, because traditionally we have generation, transmission, distribution, and to the customer. So when do transmission system get upgraded? Is when generators want to interconnect and the ISO study those interconnection requests. Oh, there's going to be an upgrade, then we upgrade our system. Or our load is increasing, we need to upgrade the system for reliability purposes. And there are other sort of reliability upgrades that the ISO conducts analysis over and develop plans to upgrade our transmission system. What we're saying here in the request for advancing or reforming transmission planning is, if we wait for generators or load to increase, it's too late, because what we need to do is look out to 2050 and what the system will need beyond 2050 and beyond, and understand how do we build a transmission system that's least cost to consumers to accommodate all these things that are changing on our electricity system. So the request for ISO is to look out farther than they traditionally do, and to conduct different scenarios and understanding all of the things that we just talked about. How do we integrate large-scale renewable? How do we integrate distributed energy resources? How do we integrate advanced electrification of our buildings and transportation? Next slide, please. So some background on transmission system planning. I think we already discussed this. Essentially, there are plans. ISO is the entity that conducts regional plan on the transmission system. So the picture you have here is just a New England electricity transmission network with all the locations of offshore wind. Next slide, please. So in addition to sort of onshore, which is a traditional way of thinking about transmission, we also need to think about our transmission network to accommodate the expansion of offshore energy. There's not a single day that goes by you don't hear more about offshore wind development. And of course, Massachusetts is one of the states that's leading the charge here. And we already have 1,600 megawatts under contract being developed. And then we have another 1,600 megawatts to be contracted going through RFP right now. So we see this deployment of offshore wind to really drive a lot of offshore wind transmission development. Again, even there, we can't just wait for individual generators to request for transmission upgrades for us to upgrade the system or to start developing the plans. So the request for ISO is to conduct longer-term visions for transmission so that the states can make proper decisions about the trade-off between certain types of transmission project versus perhaps more distributed energy resources. Next slide, please. And then the third pillar to this is governance reform. The states did request ISO to restructure or reform its governance structure and mission to support the state's policy needs, particularly to pay closer attention to consumer costs and state policies and other concerns. Next slide, please. These are the recommendations coming out of the process. So what happened was in October, the states gathered together and sent ISO through NESCO a request for these reforms that I just talked about, the wholesale electricity market, the transmission planning, and its governance. And as part of that, just late last month, NESCO also issued a report that covers its recommendations coming out of this entire process. We conducted several technical conferences where we solicit input from many stakeholders, and including stakeholders that are not traditionally involved in the ISO system and system planning. And we listened and documented what we've heard. And part of the recommendation for governance change, and some argue that this is probably the most important change for ISO New England, is to make sure that the state's voices and the stakeholders' voices are broader and are heard, as well as all of the board of director meetings and how decisions are made more transparent to states and other stakeholders. So here, again, I'm not going to read all of it, but these are the recommendations coming from NESCO in transforming the governance at ISO New England. Next slide, please. I want to point to you this report that NESCO just put out at the end of last month in June. It has everything that I've just explained, plus more, and recommendation back to the governors of what the states can do to help advance the changes that we need in the wholesale electricity market and the system and the governance of ISO. So that's what I have prepared, and I'm more than happy to answer questions at the end of the other panelists' presentation. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Judy. And for those of us who don't live and breathe the wholesale market structures, thanks for the great overview of the territory that we're wading into. So I'll now turn it over to Greg Geller, who's going to both reflect some of the high-level issues, but then also dive into some details about potential additional market mechanisms. Greg?
Thank you, John, for the opportunity, and also to Undersecretary Chang for those comments. It's inspiring just to see how ambitious the Commonwealth is, and also for Enel. We're so glad to be a part of contributing to achieving the Commonwealth's ambitious goals. So I want to do three things today. First, I want to start off with the problem we think we need to solve, and some of it's going to sound familiar to what Undersecretary Chang just said. The second part that I want to spend the bulk of my presentation on are the solutions that we think there could be to solving this problem, and then want to briefly close with I think what should be a good segue to the final presentation is just a call to action for the end use customers that are part of this webinar today. So if you can go ahead to the next slide, please. So very similar to what Undersecretary Chang just said, the problem we're trying to solve is really how do we decarbonize as quickly as possible, as reliably as possible, and as competitively and least cost as possible. And so for a starting point, I think it's important to realize that today, the wholesale market in New England, despite New England being a true leader in trying to address climate change, more than 2/3 approximately of all generation that's earning capacity payments is fossil resources. So that's where we are right now, despite all the progress that we've made today. So clearly we've got, if we want to decarbonize, the resources that we're going to be calling on summer days like this, we need to have a cleaner resource mix than today. So just diving into that a little bit more, and if you can go to the next slide, please. So this slide is, it's a bit of an old slide, but I think it's still incredibly relevant today. And it comes from ISO New England. And what they were doing in this slide here is they were looking at the impact of behind the meter solar on the electric grid. And as you would expect, as more and more solar comes online, it's great because it decreases the peak, and especially decreases it when the sun is out, right? But it's also pushes the peak to later and later in the day when solar is unavailable. And so if you go ahead to the next slide, we see the same issue in the winter, but even more pronounced. And you see these pretty steep ramps that as solar stops producing and you get into the evening hours where you have high demand, the question becomes, where are we going to get our energy from? And the answer is, if we want to decarbonize, is we're going to need a lot of clean, flexible resources. Now, it's terrific what's happening with offshore wind, and that's going to be a really big resource. But you can look at the size of the ramp that we have, the size of the need during that winter hour, and it becomes clear the magnitude of clean, flexible resources that we need, such as energy storage, flexible load demand response, and electric vehicle charging infrastructure, electric school buses. So the key takeaway here is, as the title suggests, decarbonization is going to require a lot of clean, flexible resources. And it becomes then really important to figure out, how are we going to get those resources built? How are we going to reform wholesale markets? How are we going to reform the way we do state procurements to attract the participation in the development of those resources at the scale that we're going to need? So if you can go to the next slide, please. And so this is going to be the last problem slide before we start getting into solutions. But right now we have a fairly siloed approach. The ISO New England forward capacity market, it was set up in a very different time, as John noted at the outset, and its primary focus was providing reliability at the least cost. It doesn't consider the carbon emissions from plants. So you could have a power plant from the 1960s with a lot of carbon emissions, but if it can meet the reliability requirements and it's the least cost resource, it's going to clear the capacity auction, and it will be counted on days like this. Now, I will say there's RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. I don't want to discount the importance of that and the role that's played in cleaning up the New England grid. It's been hugely impactful, but we still have a forward capacity market today that focuses on least cost reliability. Our clean energy procurements historically have really treated all megawatt hours the same, regardless of when they're produced, where they're produced, how much they contribute to decarbonization. Again, very successful overall, and we've seen tremendous growth in clean energy resources, but they've not made that distinction for the most part. Aside from some really, I think, excellent programs here in Massachusetts, they've just started, including the Massachusetts Clean Peak program, the Massachusetts Connected Solutions programs, that tries to incent the deployment and the discharge of resources, flexible resources, including behind the meter storage during these peak times. If you want to learn more about those programs, would certainly encourage you to get in touch, do some Googling. Our utilities in Massachusetts do a great job administering connected solutions, and Nell would be glad to speak with you. But there's those are really some standout programs, I think, leaders in the nation. But the main point is we've got a really siloed approach right now that is not sustainable if we want to decarbonize as quickly, as reliably, and competitively as possible. Okay, so now let's start going to the solutions. If you can go ahead to the next slide, please. What are the 3 principles for achieving competitive, reliable decarbonization? Well, the first principle, we think, is enabling state and customer choice, not just for clean energy, but also for capacity as well, and to break the silos that we just highlighted on the last slide. So you recall that I started out the presentation talking about around how 2/3 of the capacity market today are fossil resources. And you'll recall how Undersecretary Chang talked about, I think, we want by 2030 to decarbonize by 50% from 1990 levels. Now that's going to expand beyond the electricity markets. But if in 2030, our capacity market is still producing almost 2/3 fossil resources, it's very clear how it would become a major challenge to reach those decarbonization goals in a competitive fashion. We need to be well below that mark if we're going to be successful. The second thing is regional competition has been really important for competitiveness and for keeping costs as low as possible throughout the region. We need to preserve that and build on that. But we also need to better utilize locational price signals to account for the reliability value in everything that we do, and try and better co-optimize between capacity and clean energy. And finally, going back to the slides I showed a few slides ago on solar and those ramps, we need to send better price signals for clean and flexible resources. Those price signals really do not exist today outside of the programs in Massachusetts. So these are the 3 principles for achieving competitive, reliable decarbonization. On the next slide, thank you. Just get into more of the recommendations and get into even more detail on the next slide. So I'll go through this quickly. So for the forward capacity market, what can we do? Well, right now, the capacity market doesn't distinguish between resources that can respond in 10 minutes or 30 minutes, or that take 10, 12 hours to start up. And from those charts, and you can see how quickly that we're going to need energy when we have those morning ramps, those evening ramps. So we really think it's important to prioritize the procurement of flexible resources in the capacity market in a way that we don't do today. And we also need to start scrutinizing the value of fossil resources. For a while now, we've had grid operators, rightly so, want to understand what is the reliability value of an intermittent resource. But we haven't really put a spotlight on fossil resources. How do they perform when it's 98 degrees? How do they perform when it's 5 degrees? We're seeing more and more extreme weather. And so if we want to decarbonize, we're going to need to look at how are fossil resources performing when the grid needs them most and during these extreme weather scenarios. So that's going to be important. We also need to allow customers, like many of you that are part of this webinar today, to purchase as much clean capacity as you want. If you're a real estate owner or a university and you've got strong decarbonization goals, then you should be able to express that not just in the PPAs that you do, but we should make sure that the capacity market is clearing a set of resources that's consistent with those objectives. And finally, this is something is really some excellent work's been done on recently. And so a recommendation hasn't been made to ISO New England on this, but we think getting more data is an important start. For instance, what are the 5-minute intervals of the day when we see the highest emissions? Where could we deploy a battery storage project that would give the region the greatest bang for its buck in terms of carbon abatement value? And then finally, that can inform the clean energy procurements that we do. If we start having more information on that, then what we can do in our clean energy procurements is better value the resources based off of their avoided emissions and also their contributions to reliability. Next slide, please. And if we get those right, what we can start doing is sending a much better price signal for that resource that can reliably deliver on a cold winter night and displace inefficient fossil units. So you might be thinking so far, well, geez, isn't this all carbon price? Isn't this carbon pricing? And look, carbon pricing could definitely be a big part of the solution. But we think there's some other solutions that directly address some of these capacity issues that really merit consideration. If you go to the next slide, please. One of those solutions is the integrated clean capacity market that the Brattle Group has developed and suggested. And so you heard Undersecretary Chang talk about the forward clean energy market, and we think there's a lot of important positive elements of that that are included in the capacity market. But why we think, that are included as part of this integrated clean capacity market. But we think it's important to go beyond that forward clean energy market, because when you think about the clean, flexible resources that we're going to need, those resources often are not energy intensive resources. They don't produce a lot of megawatt hours. And so if we want to develop those kinds of resources at scale, just focusing on a clean energy market without thinking about our capacity market and working that in, we don't think that's going to be the solution to attract these resources at scale. And so you don't have the time today to get into all the mechanics of how the integrated clean capacity market will work. So I'll just go over briefly and then we can get into more. There's some excellent white papers that have been developed on it. They'd be glad to point people that are interested towards. But the main takeaways are that it's intended to co-optimize capacity and clean energy, but it preserves the broad regional market structure that we think has worked really well today. If you can just go to the next slide where we get a little more detail. So we think there's 3 really important parts of the integrated clean capacity market that would have to be in any final market design for it to really work and achieve the principles that we outlined at the beginning. One is that states should have, and all customers should have, the option to impose a maximum amount on the share of capacity that's procured for them from fossil resources. So if Massachusetts, has these goals by 2030, and we want to say, well, there's, 12 gigawatts that needs to be procured for Massachusetts, we should be able to say that over time, as we get closer to 2030, that the amount that comes from fossil resources should really decrease. And by decreasing that gradually over time and reliably over time, we'll start to send better price signals for cleaner resources and flexible resources. Building off that, the flexible capacity needs at the bottom, starting to say, okay, we have this capacity market, a certain amount of these resources needs to come from resources that can respond in 10 or 30 minutes. And finally, when we think about states and customers that are doing clean energy procurements, trying to tie clean energy credits to the carbon abatement value of those resources. So those are three things that we think are important. Just to be clear, this slide comes from the battle group, as did the last slide. We just highlighted these three pieces here in orange that we think are important to have. So there's a number of different ways to get at this, but we think the integrated clean capacity market and these three areas are really deserve to be at the forefront of consideration. If you can go to the next slide, please. So I'll just briefly end the solutions part of the discussion with some materials that have come out recently from a group called MRETS that's been working with Google and others on helping customers that really want to decarbonize focus on matching clean energy with their overall load profile. So if you're a customer who is still consuming energy at midnight, and you want to make sure that that energy is matched with renewable energy, is matched with clean energy, that there's a mechanism to do that. And we think the more that data becomes available and the more we see a push from customers to push for that 24/7 matching, that's going to send more price signals for the clean, flexible resources that we're going to need. And so we think there's some really important innovations there that are happening. So just being mindful of time, let me end the solutions part there. And just in terms of the call to action, which I think Madeline will get it much more into, we've seen customers have a really important impact in the past. And it doesn't require showing up at every ISO New England meeting to do that, because I know a lot of you are just way too busy. But even some kind of informal coalition of customers across New England, across Massachusetts, wherever it is, we've seen those types of groups be very helpful. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission just started an Office of Public Participation. They want to hear from customers as well. So I hope that one of the things that comes out of this is a discussion on how end-use customers like all of you can get more engaged if you want the region to decarbonize as competitively and reliably as possible. Thank you, John. I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Greg, and thanks for the transition, because that is where we're going to go next. So Maddie's going to talk about the PJM Cities and Communities Coalition and the City of Philadelphia's participation in it, and sort of how they organized cities over a pretty vast geography to be able to weigh in on wholesale market reforms. Maddie, it's all yours.
Great, thank you. So thank you for inviting me today. I'm excited to share what we've been working on as a coalition, as well as how we've organized to achieve some common goals of decarbonization. So as previously mentioned, my name is Maddie Schuh. I work at the City of Philadelphia in the Energy Office, and I serve as our city representative in the PJM Cities and Communities Coalition. So next slide. Okay. So PJM Cities and Communities Coalition, or PJM-CCC for short, is a group of 10 chartered members who came together in 2018 to understand how our clean energy and climate goals could be represented within PJM's decision-making structure. Since then, PJM-CCC has developed into a formal entity that helps its members use their collective power as cities and communities, both as large end-use customers and in representing the interests of our community members to deepen our members' understanding of wholesale markets and related regulatory bodies. And so as you can see in the graphic, all of our members have some type of clean energy or climate goal. Most of them are fairly ambitious and will require significant changes in order to achieve them. And so this, along with a couple other reasons that I'll get into later, were part of the impetus for the formation of PJM-CCC. So next slide. So in addition to each member's individual commitments to clean energy and climate, all members share the goal of removing and preventing barriers to decarbonization solutions in our regional wholesale electricity markets. And then the coalition also provides a platform towards achieving these through member education and capacity building, partnership and collaboration with aligned organizations, and opportunities to work together to achieve common goals. And as you can see, PJM is very big. Our members span the whole range of PJM. So this has been really helpful. The coalition has been really helpful in kind of aligning what we're working on and working towards these common goals. So next slide. So as we were organizing, PJM received both support from NLX in kind of terms of formulating what all we could achieve or how we should structure things. And then we also received a grant from USDN to fund our first year. And as part of that grant, we partnered with World Resources Institute, or WRI, to be our grant partner. And with their support, we developed and adopted a formal charter that establishes the coalition's governance model and membership options. And so we decided on a shared governance model in order to promote partnership, equity, accountability, and ownership for all members. At the same time, we recognize that all cities have different bandwidth to commit to the coalition. So we developed 3 different membership tiers to reflect these differences. And then since our original founding, we actually expanded to include communities. Originally, our name was PJM Cities Coalition, but we expanded since we recognize that there are other large groups within PJM with similar goals who might be interested in joining the coalition and advocating for decarbonization. And so I would say that developing these has been really important for the coalition, especially as we've grown. First it outlines just what we're trying to do and kind of our rules for engagement. And then it's also been really helpful as we've released public statements since it outlines our voting structure. And so if we're signing on to a statement as PJM-CCC, we want to make sure that all members have can voice their support or that they would prefer us not to sign on. So it structures that voting. And then kind of in the day-to-day of the coalition, we have 2 different committees or working groups. So policy and steering committees, and we meet bi-weekly to discuss issues and advance goals. And then we also have an all-coalition call that's monthly. And in our all-coalition call, we have it structured so that half of the meeting is kind of, just general coalition business, and the other half, we invite a guest speaker to provide education to the coalition members. So next slide. So when we formed in 2018, we saw 3 main barriers to robust engagement with the wholesale electricity markets. And those are education, expertise, and lack of transparency. And so I think, as everybody knows, wholesale electricity markets are vast and complex. But on top of that, all cities and communities are not created equal, and that they have varying levels of funding, technical support, and expertise. And historically, this has led to under-participation of some cities and communities. So we saw PJM-CCC as a way to organize, come together, bridge gaps, and share knowledge and expertise, so that collectively we can all more fully participate and amplify our shared priorities with one voice. Next slide. So in order to achieve our decarbonization goals and overcome the barriers, education, expertise, and lack of transparency, we've been focusing on engagement and education as a coalition. So in terms of engagement, we're working across a variety of different pathways, including, public, FERC, RTO, attending different workshops, different hearings, partnering with non-government organizations, et cetera. more than anything, we've just been trying to engage with all of the different players in the space and understand what they're doing, and then also just have a presence as a coalition that is unified. And so we have had some success with this in that PJM has become more aware of city and community needs, and we have established relationships at different levels, which has been very helpful. So in terms of capacity building within the organization, our main path has been sharing resources, sharing knowledge, and then also bringing in speakers to our monthly meetings so that everybody's getting the education that they might need in order to be able to fully participate in these space. So I think one really great example of how this has been working for us is when the minimum offer price or minimum offer price rule, or MOPR, came out. We worked as a coalition to understand how it would impact all of us and how it could impact our clean energy goals. And so rather than each city or community trying to go it alone and understand what it was, how it would affect them, and making some type of statement, we were able to work together and share resources. And this was really important because it allowed us to act quickly and through our different engagement channels, start making our dissatisfaction with it heard. And so while we were one of many voices that were expressing dissatisfaction, I think it's really meaningful that as a coalition, we were able to participate and we were able to have this unified city voice of 10 different cities and communities within PJM expressing this opinion and expressing how it would affect us. So next slide. So a few different ways that we have been kind of making statements or engaging. I'm going to highlight one that's a letter we sent to the PJM Board of Managers. So we sent this in 2019 during their CEO search. And in this letter, we asked them to view the leadership transition as an opportunity to support clean energy development. And the letter also underscored the need to prioritize candidates who would move PJM towards a decarbonized grid. And so this letter allowed us to publicly highlight our priorities for PJM leadership, which is important to achieving our goals and overcoming the barriers that we see to full participation. So next slide. So second area is around storage policy. And there's a couple pieces to this one. So the first is that we made a statement regarding storage in PJM. And in that we were able to communicate the connection between market rules and city priorities. And then actually since then, we've partnered with a consultant to do some research to undertake or to understand how the role cities can play in distributed energy resources and be responsive to market rules. So it's not quite the same, but it's kind of in that same space. And then the other area is that PJM's work and policies were referenced in comments made in like a partnership between Sustainable FERC, NRDC, Union of Concerned Scientists, and Sierra Club on the Effective Load Carrying Capability, or ELCC. And so this was important to us because it shows the weight city and community voices can have in this space. And then it also shows the traction that PJM-CCC is gaining as a respected stakeholder. So next slide. And so in terms of engagement with FERC, there's two pathways that we've chosen, public statements and then attendance in different FERC events. So this year, we actually made comments on the creation of the Office of Public Participation. And Greg, I think you mentioned this earlier, that this was being created, but we made a verbal statement and then also submitted a written statement. In this, we expressed that cities are unique stakeholders for FERC and OPP, that energy markets must advance equitable outcomes, and that expanded engagement in the RTO is key, and that the diversity of people affected by wholesale market decisions are not represented in the rulemaking process. So in terms of FERC events, we try to attend the events and workshops so that we understand what's happening, we can see what's coming, and then also that we're engaging as a coalition within their process. So next slide. So the last type of engagement that I'm going to mention is with an RTO. So in 2020, we established direct communications with PJM's State and Policy Member Services Department. And so this has been really helpful because we've met with them a couple of times and we've been able to discuss our concerns with, recent rulings or different, things that are coming or things that have happened. We've been able to share the progress that PJM CCC has made in terms of, achieving our goals or with making different statements. And then it's also been helpful to show the ways in which city and community voices are helpful to PJM when they develop policy. So we're able to understand that directly from them, how we can be helpful. And then kind of a nice outcome from that is the research that I mentioned earlier about distributed energy resources. In conversation with this PJM State and Policy Member Services Department, we were able to kind of fine tune our research questions so that we were answering or we were asking it in a way that could eventually be helpful both to them and to us, so we could understand more fully, what that interplay could be. So next slide. So just to sum it all up, cities and communities have a unique lever as both large electricity users and public sector entities. Our unified voice advocating for decarbonization in our regional electricity markets are stronger than individual ones. And building capacity through knowledge sharing enables more robust participation in a complex field. And then just for anyone who might be interested in forming something similar to PJM CCC, I think some of the things that were especially helpful for us were establishing a charter and mission statement early, and then also partnering with a really great consultant who can help support your work and help support the everyday, since for many of us, participation in PJM CCC is an add-on to our day-to-day. And then the very last thing is that there is a project that is in progress right now through DOE, and it's called U.S. Local Government Engagement in Wholesale Electricity Market Level Issues that Impact Clean Energy Development. And the goal of this is to provide a framework for the different avenues for engagement on wholesale electricity market issues. And so when this is completed, it might be of interest to people who are interested in organizing to advance clean energy development at the wholesale level. And then also if you're interested in developing something similar to PJM CCC. So next slide. So that wraps up what I was going to say, but if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them in the Q&A.
Great, thanks, Maddie. So we will now turn to the Q&A session, and we'll get all the panelists, get the slides off and get all the panelists on and jump into the questions. Just a reminder, we have a bunch of questions already in the chat box, and it would be great if anybody else has any other questions. And before we do get into the Q&A, I do just want to note, anybody who registered will be getting a notification of our next GRCx event, which is going to be really interesting and creative. It's going to be looking at how our different perspectives on time affect our responses to climate change, and it's going to involve a bunch of folks who have studied and looked on that. So a little bit of a diversion from some of our more technical presentations. And then secondly, for those of you interested, obviously, in these wholesale market issues, I want to put a push in for the upcoming September 24th RAB Roundtable, which is going to be focused on wholesale market reform. Secretary Chang is going to be part of the panel, as is the chair of FERC and as is the CEO of ISO New England. So it ought to be a really interesting and informative panel for this. And actually, before we get into the participant questions, since Maddie's last sort of reference was to FERC, I would like to ask Judy and Greg to just make any comments about what kinds of changes are being contemplated at FERC, because it feels like this is a really ground shifting kind of change that is happening? And then a second question, which was an audience question, is if you look at all the things that you're recommending ISO New England to, like where do they need FERC permission to do any of these things, or do they have the authority to do it? So if the two of you could weigh in on that and just give us that framing at the front end, that'd be useful. And then we'll jump into the other questions.
Yeah, those are great questions. I'll start, and Greg may have even may actually be even closer to some of the answers. FERC, this current FERC set of commissioners definitely have taken to heart not only our New England's proposed changes, but also, as you know, Maddie talked about, same thing for other regions. And this kind of effort is actually coming from various different jurisdictions. So FERC is embracing this whole market design reform. You know, New England, New York, PJM are all going through this, what Madeline talked about, the change of to MOPR, the minimum offer price rule. And that will not only have a dramatic change in the capacity market and what qualifies, it will drive a whole bunch of other changes. So that is an important move, I think, and the various different alternatives will have a chance to have a place, a voice in this change that FERC has already initiated. And so FERC has already initiated a whole bunch of technical conferences to talk about the three topics that I raised, that New England raised. In addition, FERC has already acted in saying we're going to change wholesale market design and transmission planning. So that's one thing on the wholesale market. On transmission planning, FERC has also discussed the need. To me, this is a huge shift, a sea change in the way we think about transmission, and this will impact really, nationally how we think about transmission planning. So FERC has already initiated a notice of policy, NOPR, a policy review, to ask all stakeholders of how we think about transmission planning, transmission pricing, cost allocation. So to me, that's another major shift that this FERC has already taken on. And then, of course, the Office for Public Participation is also a major change, as far as I could tell, over the last 20 plus years. This is really the first time that FERC is saying, oh, not only all the market participants can participate, but really we should open this up to states and cities and towns and other stakeholders that traditionally have not had a voice. So it's a big change. Regarding your question about permission, certainly wholesale market reforms and changes in the market rules, those are all subject to FERC regulation. So those, I don't know if it's permission to, any change will be subject to a hearing or a debate at FERC. Transmission planning, there are quite a bit, I think there's some leeway there. ISO New England already agreed to conducting a long-term analysis. So I think they thought that that was within their current tariff or allowed activities. To make that a more of a routine, and what the outcomes of those transmission plans, what that will, introduce, how do we evaluate different options, that probably will require some changes as well to the ISO's tariff. So I don't know about permission, but certainly certain changes will go through a FERC process for being debated and regulated at FERC. And during that process, other participants, in addition to the ones that already have a voice at ISO's deliberation, they will again have another voice at FERC. So I'll pause there. Pam.
That's great. Greg, anything you want to add into that?
I think Undersecretary Chang covered it well. Just maybe two very brief things. One is that the chair of FERC is certainly made an effort to set the course in the right direction. What will be interesting is that one of the commissioners, Commissioner Chatterjee, his term is up, and so there will be a seat to fill. And so who that fifth commissioner becomes will be really important for deciding these things, because some of the things that are being discussed around transmission reform, capacity market reform, could easily see there being a bit of a divergence of opinion amongst the four commissioners who will be after Commissioner Chatterjee. So that's something to watch for everyone. And then the last piece on the transmission reform, I think FERC has recognized that there's a big role for states to play there as well with siting. And so they developed a joint task force with a number of state regulatory commissioners to tackle the issue because of the jurisdiction that states have over that issue as well.
Great, thanks. There was actually a pretty simple question, Judy, that might not be that simple, but I think it's for you, from one of the attendees, and says, if our goal is a 50% reduction by 2030, at what percent are we now? You're on mute still. Like,
Yes, for Massachusetts, we are around 25%
okay,
relative to reduction relative to 1990 levels, not accounting for the effects of COVID, approximately.
okay, great. The next audience question was related to storage. So let me read it because it was kind of long. It says, logistically, greening the grid will take an immense amount of energy storage. For zero energy 5-person home running on solar alone would require a $2+ million battery. I'm wondering what energy storage opportunities and base generation, including nuclear, you see as a way that poses a financial way out of this puzzle. Also, with added load from electrification of transportation and buildings, load will increase. Do you see nuclear generation as a must, having to achieve zero carbon on a large ISO scale? So there seem to be two separate questions in there, one related to the role of nuclear and the other related to storage solutions. Anybody want to respond to that?
I can start on the storage piece, at least, because I saw another question too. Maybe I'll combine them if you don't mind, John, about long duration storage.
Yep.
We've seen some exciting announcements recently come out about the potential for long duration storage to be developed, and potential cost curves for that coming down. So that would obviously be a game changer for this. But I think we have to be careful about how we're going to attract that kind of investment in the market. Long duration storage, it will be expensive for a while. And so it kind of goes back to one of the central points I was trying to make of, we need to come up with new ways to attract the deployment of that long duration storage, or just energy storage in general, at the scale we're going to need it. And aside from Massachusetts Clean Peak, we don't have and Connected Solutions, we don't have mechanisms for doing that right now. I think Undersecretary Chang presented a really interesting slide earlier on. No need to bring up the slides again, but on kind of where different types of resources get their revenues from, and the breakdown between capacity, energy, and ancillary, and then forward clean energy. I think what's important to realize is that for energy storage, because it only produces in a certain number of hours, and because there's lower energy prices right now, the amount that's going to come from energy is going to be pretty limited. And the amount that would come from any forward clean energy program, unless it's really designed in a pretty dynamic fashion, would be pretty limited. And so that's why the importance of the capacity market, and the capacity market valuing those kind of resources, is going to be important if we're going to attract that kind of investment at scale. And also the importance of having our state clean energy procurements recognize the carbon abatement value that storage might provide at certain times. So I hope that starts to answer the question. See if anyone else has thoughts on that.
That's great, thanks. And any other input on the storage question? Judy, you want to put in?
Yes, I'll just say that storage will be an important component of our clean energy future, and long and short duration storage, where, while electricity storage has been around for a long time, when you start thinking about hydro storage, when it comes to battery storage, it's really, over the last 10 years or even less. So our policies in Massachusetts are to encourage storage investments, along with solar storage, solar projects. But even on its own, I think storage will be needed and will be providing a lot of advantages. So yes, storage is definitely part of the solution. The question about nuclear, I didn't catch all of the entire question, but just to put it very simply, nuclear as a clean energy resource is also part of the solution. I highly doubt that we will build any new nuclear, but when it comes to existing nuclear and really all existing clean energy resources, those are very valuable to keep our greenhouse gas emissions down. Thank you.
Great, thanks. I did want to just note that Jonathan Rabb sent a little chat in and just corrected my characterization of his September 24th thing a little bit. It is really focused on transmission specifically and transmission planning. So just wanted to kind of highlight that. Maddie, I had a follow-up question for you. So getting all of these cities together across this vast geography that you have in PJM on this sort of complicated set of issues, that doesn't feel like a trivial task. How did you actually go about doing that? And what's your advice? I mean, just from a really practical way, if we wanted to think about putting a city network together in New England, what's your advice on sort of what it takes to do that?
Yeah, definitely. So I think more than anything that has been helpful for us is having consultant support to help support the kind of day-to-day of the coalition, whether that's, note-taking, helping us plan our summit, helping organize speakers, being a content expert for, the different areas and different topics that, we don't have the expertise on. So I think having a consultant has been very helpful. I would also say having grant funding has been kind of instrumental in us being able to do what we've done. The kind of organizing across, state lines and all of that aspect I don't think has been as hard. Just that we do have all of the support. I think if we were going it alone, it would be much harder. And, everybody's already working their regular job at their city or community, and then PJM/CCC is usually an add-on. So just having the time, I think is probably the biggest barrier.
Great, thanks. And sort of a corollary to that, I think probably Greg and Judy, to both of you, like just given the current configuration of ISO New England, if you're a city or you're a large energy user, where are the current opportunities to engage in the market transformation work that's already going on? Is that joining NEPOOL? Obviously, if you're not a state, you can't be part of NESCO. Like, what are the actual current mechanisms that are in place if people are really interested in engaging?
I can start with that one. And so just so folks know, NESCO is the New England State Committee on Electricity and represents the 6 New England states, and they're an excellent organization. Undersecretary Chang could probably speak more to this, but I think they would welcome input, and they had a very public process in developing the governor's vision to encourage input, just from the types of people that are on the webinar today. But I don't think there's any hard stop on that. So it would certainly encourage engaging through them. I think if people wanted to try and there's an end users sector in NEPOOL, and there are customers that are part of that. And so I'm not an expert lawyer on this, but I think if different folks want to band together and create a new cities coalition or commercial coalition, whatever it is, I think there would be the opportunity to join NEPOOL and be active there, similar to what Madeline described for the PJM cities. So, and there would be ample time for opportunity for engagement in New England.
Great. Judy,
I concur. I think Greg covered it really well, so I don't really have much to add. I would say it's been a pleasure working with NESCO when it comes to getting the states together and align ourselves and discuss and debate on many topics. And don't want to speak on behalf of NESCO, but I think Greg is right that it's a great organization, and we certainly welcome many voices to be added to that.
A little bit of a corollary question on that to you, Judy. I mean, obviously NESCO is a version of this, but as you look forward to sort of the long-term vision, do you see a need for sort of fundamentally different kinds of collaboration and alignment among the states on their state decarbonization policies? Or do you see the collaborative structure of NESCO in essence serving that purpose well, or does that set of relationships need to get restructured in some way?
I think the NESCO is serving the state's interests well. It is a very collaborative approach, and the most important thing is the states trust NESCO to represent in a coherent and cohesive way the voices of the state. And I would, in a way, echo Madeline's comment. Most state entities don't really have a dedicated staff to work on wholesale electricity market things. So NESCO is helping with that, but at the end of the day, state representatives still have to, take a lot of time to understand the issues, the tension, the participants, and what can work and what cannot work. And NESCO has successfully really drove the states and helped the states to get to that level of understanding, at least sufficient amount of understanding to advance our voices or to help. So I do not think there is a need to restructure how the states engage with each other. I think the more we do it, the more the states trust each other, that we understand that we have some diverse views and diverse policies. Not every state has exactly the same policy. So we respect each other's policies while we also understand directionally, I think as a region, we are moving toward decarbonizing or lower the emissions of our entire system.
Great. There was a follow-up question there on transmission that somebody you may want to have a weigh in on, which is, in addition to the transmission planning process that needs to be changed, are there ideas about how to solve the difficult issues of transmission siting and all of the issues that come up with that both at the transmission level, and of course we're seeing it now at the distribution level, as cities need more substations. Where do we put them, and how do we organize the process? Is there an aspect of that that's in the vision that you've articulated that you could share?
Good question. Great question. Siting is, like everything else, has multiple layers of challenges. One, I think I want to just say that we do need to help our citizens and communities understand the importance of infrastructure, because it's going to be really hard as is to decarbonize, and we can't do it without building some infrastructure. Obviously, we don't want to build excess infrastructure or increase the cost, but we do need to educate our communities about that, and that's part of siting. When it comes to, is there a reform necessary for siting? I think there is plenty of opportunities to improve siting processes, and that gets even more complicated because transmission, has federal siting and has state siting issues. But just speaking for the states on siting any electric system infrastructure, even that for Massachusetts, we have, I think, more work to do to help facilitate better siting, perhaps more streamlined siting, while respecting stakeholders' ability to voice their concerns and address those concerns. Unfortunately, I don't have one clear answer to address all of the issues. I wish I did, but I would just say that, yeah, siting is extremely important, and we can't get anything built without proper siting. And that is not included in the vision statement, but it is something that as a state, we're still working on.
Great, thank you. There was a specific question related to rate structures. I'm not sure if there's a wholesale, market structure question or not, but it's like, what kinds of incentives are needed to incentivize off-peak use of renewables? This would get into whatever the tariff is for EV charging, as an example, and get into more detailed, time of use charging, etc. I'm not sure if that's a wholesale market question or whether that's a DPU question, but Greg, I know you guys are deeply involved in this through your EV and your storage work, but if either of you could respond to that, that would be helpful.
Sure, I can start. Yeah, I don't think it would be a wholesale one, but certainly important. We've seen some of the most effective jurisdictions at getting storage installed have tried to be a lot more granular with their rate design, with their distribution level rate design, right? So traditionally you kind of see an on-peak and an off-peak, and the on-peak lasts maybe 10, 12 hours, and the off-peak lasts 10, 12 hours. Without really accounting for what might be super peaks, right? And periods of time where there's real spikes in usage, and maybe it's just 2 hours or 4 hours of usage that are driving the cost of infrastructure in that distribution network. And so what we've seen happen in Con Edison's territory in New York, for example, is they have these rate structures that will basically create these super peaks where they're just looking at the top 4 hours in a specific network, and they send a price signal to customers to say, hey, if you can reduce your usage during these 4 hours, you're going to save a whole lot on your bill, and hundreds of thousands of dollars per megawatt year. And so once you send that price signal to customers, then you're actually going to create a real incentive to deploy things that can enable flexible loads like storage, and that will actually help achieve, I think, the objective of the question. What the question is trying to get at is push more usage to off-peak times, and when there's higher penetration of renewable energy.
Yes, absolutely. We do need to push usage to the time when essentially we have energy that's least cost. Period. Like, I'm a big believer in demand response and flexible load. We need all of those things. And we have an opportunity here, and there is a docket at the Massachusetts DPU to look at least pricing for charging during off-peak, charging transportation at off-peak. But we do need, I talk about reforms. That's another area there's a lot of work to be done. We want to get to a point where we want to maximize the efficiency of the system, right? So we want customers to use the electricity when the electricity is very cheap or the wind is blowing like crazy. And we saw this in the Midwest when there is excess wind energy at night and in spring and fall times. And those are the times that you want people to charge up their cars. And I think the future will look like that. The future will be better signals to consumers so that we can better use our infrastructure.
That's great. So there are no more questions in the chat box. So I think we've answered, we've dealt with any of the issues that have come up. I want to thank all of you for having joined us and helping educate us and incentivize us to get engaged in this. We're at quite a pivotal time in the climate challenge battle, radically upping our game, and that means that we need to be able to engage in sometimes these really complicated issues about how we structure our systems to help us achieve our goals. And you have all just done a great job of allowing us to have some sense of how this works and how we might get involved. So really want to thank you all and appreciate your time and attention. And to all the participants, those of you who are registered, anybody who registered will be getting a link to both the video and the panelist presentations in a day or two after it's done. So Judy and Greg and Maddie, thank you again. And with that, we'll close it out. Take care.
Thank you so much.